Good morning, everyone. 80 years ago, just over 80 years ago, I came to this country as a refugee from a country called Czechoslovakia. Now, of course, it's two different countries, Czechia, as they call it, in Slovakia. There's an organization in this country called the Holocaust Trust, and each year they form a saying. Do not stand by. The power of words. How can life go on? And torn from home. And each of these phrases are very much linked with my own story. There are words, simple words, like trains. And there were trains where you could not buy a return ticket. Labels. We all wear labels. Camps. Holiday camps. Concentration camps. Tattoos. These days, practically everyone has them. And these were numbers on people's arms. Lists. Lists of people waiting to be deported. Stand on the left if you're going on an escalator. Stand on the left if you're due to go to the gas. The stars and the moon and the sun and the composer Bach all play a part in this story. But my story goes back to 1935. I was living with my parents in a small town, and my father was a local councillor. He was a very young man, but he was a great admirer of a German author called Thomas Mann. Thomas Mann had been exiled from Germany. He'd written some very unpleasant articles about Hitler and some books, and he was living in Switzerland with his family with no passport. As famous as he was, he couldn't travel, and my father had the idea of saying, why don't we make him a Czech citizen? Why don't we give him domicile? And he had the permission from the Czech president to go to Switzerland to offer Thomas Mann and his family Czech passports. And with these passports, he was very pleased to accept them. He was able to travel. He came to thank our little village for doing this, and eventually went to America. And again, you can read all about him. He wrote some very wonderful books. And this is the picture of Thomas Mann. This was in 1936. By 1939, Austria was already occupied by the Germans, and the Czechs knew that eventually the Czech lands will also be occupied. In 1938, 10,000 German and Austrian children were already evacuated refugees to England. But by 1939, Mr. Chamberlain, the then Prime Minister, and Hitler had agreed, as long as Germany could have certain parts of Czechoslovakia, the border country known as the Sudetenland, there will not be a war. And although there were many Czech parents who by now were desperate to send their children to England, England said, no, we don't want any more refugees. The only way we could get refugees into the country is if they found a family, if money is paid for them. Anyway, no more refugees. On the March of 13th, 1939, two men came to visit my father. Already the Germans were moving into the country to occupy it, and they said, we know that tomorrow, as soon as the Gestapo reach Prague, you will be arrested, and we suggest that you leave. These two men came from the Czech underground. And so my father, without any more ado, said he would have to leave. I have to say, I don't remember this. I was at that time not quite 9 years old. But he was sent to Berlin, of all places where you would send a person to be saved, to Berlin. And if you remember that phrase, do not stand by. When he got out of the train in Berlin, he was met by an officer, a soldier, thinking he'd been caught. He was taken to a safe house. The next day he flew to Brussels, but by the time he got to Brussels, his Czech money was useless. They were going to send him back, and there was a stranger standing by. And he was asking my father, what's the problem? Because he was pleading with the authorities to let him carry on. And when my father explained his problem, this man said, well, my son was born yesterday, so I'm going to celebrate it by giving you some money. Go to England. I'll fast forward to 1945. First thing my father wanted to do was to find the two people who had literally helped him to escape. And he did find in Brussels Henry Bugenhout, but he didn't know who was this mysterious soldier that helped him all those years ago. Well, my father became a radio amateur. Now, I don't think even your teachers will know what that is. He became a radio ham, and these were little radios that you could contact people simply by signals, and you could talk to them all over the world. They were known as radio hams. Look it up on your internet. And in 1939, he got a message to go to Germany. The radio amateurs were having a meeting. When he arrived in this particular room where they were meeting, his friend said to him, Rudolf, you see this man standing over there? That is Joachim Schreiber. That is the soldier who helped you, and this was in 1959. All those years ago in Berlin, they managed to find the other man who did not stand by and save my father. Well, I'm staying with those years because in 1940, I was lucky enough that my mother managed to escape. And she escaped from Norway, from Prague, Norway, and into England. And I only discovered those documents that you see on there 4 years ago. They were in the archives in Oslo, and I was trying to find out how my mother had got to England, and discovered that on there it does say that she had permits to come to England. I'm going back now to 1939. This is in May. I was 9 and my sister was 3.5. My mother told us that we were to come to England. We knew that my father was there. We had no messages from him at the time. And on on July the 31st, I was taken to the railway station with my sister to be put on the train to leave. And with my mother came my grandfather. That was me at the time. And my grandfather gave me an autograph book, which I have here. And in the book he wrote, remember to be faithful to the country that you're leaving, to your parents, and to your grandfather, who loves you very much. Prague, the 31st of July, 9 o'clock in the evening, 1939. And I was put on the train with my sister, wearing a label. This is the label, and this is the label that I wore. On the train with me was my sister, of course, and 2 other girls, strangely enough, in my carriage, with whom I kept in touch all our years that we've been here in England. Sadly, one has died, and the other one is very ill, but we kept in touch all our lives. And one of the girls who was with me eventually wrote a book. When my grandfather gave me an autograph book, her father gave her a diary, and this is what she wrote in her diary on the day just before she had to leave. When I was ready for bed, my mother came to tuck me in. The excitement I'd felt all day had subsided, and looking around my room and seeing all the things I was leaving behind, realizing I would be on my way made me homesick even before I left. My mother, as if reading my thoughts, hugged me and said, "There will be times when you'll feel lonely and homesick. It's only natural. But remember, you're our precious brave little diamond, and your tears are pearls." And she carried me in her arms to the window, and together we looked out at the starlit night. And she said, "If the time ever comes when we can't write to each other, the sun and the stars which shine on you will be shining on us too, wherever we are. And let us make the sun and the stars the messengers of our love and thoughts, and through them we will always be close." And the last letter that Vera got from her mother. "Today the frost is sharp, but the sun is shining and bringing your love. It seems as if the sun is particularly bright, as if he wanted to say, your Vera is sending you her love and happy thoughts. Each night I look at the stars, and they seem to be whispering, 'Have faith.' Yes, we have faith. And so, my darling children, be healthy and happy. Believe me, we now know that sending you to those good people was the right thing to do." And Vera, like many other children, never saw her parents again. I never saw my grandparents again, my aunts and my cousins, who at the time were the same age as I was when I left. My sister, when she grew up, she could remember nothing of the journey. She was only 3. And she eventually became a teacher and a headmistress. And in her 60s, because she still had her label, started thinking about her past, not really remembering anything, except she wrote some poems. And 2 of them are about her label. "639, a label hangs around my neck. Fleischmann, the British Refugee Committee." Destination, Liverpool Street Station. A brown broken label with a missing piece and a misspelt word hangs on my neck. 639. This brown broken label with a missing piece and its misspelt word, in its imperfect whole, identifies me. It hangs around my neck. It holds me in its thrall. Such evidence of conflict, so much illogical logic, pure evil, and so much good. How can all so rest in one? But on my label they do. 639 is my number, my label. My brown wrinkled label with a missing piece and a misspelt word, in its imperfect whole, bears witness. It hangs still on my soul, but I'm here to honor and celebrate us all. And so we traveled on that train and through Germany into Holland, where we met. At that time Holland was still an unoccupied country, and put onto a great big ship, I should say. We had never seen the sea. And from there we were sent to Harwich. And, you know, all of us had to pack something with us. We carried what were known as rucksacks. And I talked to year 6, and they're 11 and 10 and 11 years old, and I said, "What would you put in your rucksacks?" What do they all call out? "Mobiles." But of course in those days we had no mobiles. But we had books and photographs. And this was my permit to travel. And one of the books that I had in my rucksack was this. Now, I wonder if any of you would recognize what it could be. It's a checkbook. It's a rat and a frog. Would the teachers know what the book was? Wind in the Willows. Wind in the Willows is a very famous English book. How many of you read Wind in the Willows? Put it in your library. So I had an English book with me, but I didn't realize. I also had a book called Robinson Crusoe. You heard of Robinson Crusoe? Yes? No? And a third one called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a very famous book about slaves and very popular in America. But I hadn't realized that I was carrying 3 English books with me. Well, we got to Harwich, from Harwich on to London, and there in the railway in Liverpool Street Station, I met my English parents, the English people who were going to take me in. My father was in England, but he was ill. He couldn't look after us. And we were met by a man called Mr. Ratcliffe, soon to be known as Daddy Ratcliffe, and taken to Ashton-under-Lyne, not very far from Manchester. And the Ratcliffes lived in a terrace house, front room, kitchen with a bath in it, and 2 bedrooms. And they had a daughter called Mary, and because they couldn't keep all of us and they didn't want to separate us, they sent Mary to live with their grandmother so that they could look after us. And there is Daddy Ratcliffe and Mummy Ratcliffe, my sister and me and Mary. And you can see that we were 2 very happy little girls. We really had no inkling what had been happening, and because my father was living quite close by, we spoke no English at the time when we came, but very soon we got used to living there and we were very happy with the Ratcliffes. But as I said earlier on, suddenly in 1940 my mother appeared. Now my mother was a doctor. My father, in his profession, he'd been an accountant, but because during the war no refugees were allowed to work, although we were allowed to get a little house ourselves, live together, people were wondering how we could possibly afford it. But the Czech government had set up an office in London in exile, and they had some funds for refugees, and we were given all of £2.10 a week. That's £2.50 in your money. And the rent for this little house was at that time 15 shillings. Now in today's money that's 75p. You can imagine a weekly rent for 75p, but 15 shillings was a lot of money in those days. And so there we were again, a little family living together. But because my father didn't want me to forget my own language, and the Czech government had set up a Czech boarding school, this is where I was sent. Now that may look very wonderful, but it was in fact a very old, decrepit building that hadn't been lived in for a long time. And in that school, sorry, let me go back. There it is. There were about 7 of us. There were about 70 of us. Our teachers were Czech soldiers who'd come over with the Czech army in 1940, and amongst them there were professors from school, so they came to teach us at the school. And there is my autograph book, which I kept with me, and there are names of friends going back to 1943, and believe me, with all those children who were at the school, we kept in touch as long as we could, all our lives, because we were almost like a family. I stayed at the school until 1945, but because this building was in such bad condition, one day the ceiling fell down in the dining room. We were all to be moved. There we are at the school, and those are the children on the front steps. We were eventually moved to Wales, and that was a much nicer place. It used to be a hotel, and it was a little village called Llanortyd Wells, right in the middle of the Brecon Hills. Now, the village was so small that hardly seen any English, and all of a sudden a whole troop of refugee children turn up. Well, how to introduce ourselves, what could we do? So we gave a concert, and we sang for them in Czech and in Slovak, but the last song we sang was the Welsh national anthem in Welsh, and they adopted us. And so from that day, from 1945, we never forgot Llanotted Wells. And when we all grew up, we used to visit regularly. We came back, the village was designated as a town, and we gave the mayor the first mayoral chain. And underneath you can see what it says. Llanotted Wells, the smallest town in land, remains forever the greatest in our hearts. And we planted a lime tree, and we still keep going back after all these years. The lime tree is now a big tree. And each time some of us return, the town hall puts up a Czech flag. And not long ago, they're twinned with a wonderful Czech town. And on the last visit, there's the mayor of today, and that is the chain now full of all the names of the other mayors. But we have a great memory. We still visit Llanotted Wells. However, that's all very well. It's now 1945. I leave school, I go ahead, and for 20 years, I have no idea how I came to England. And in fact, it was more than 20 years. In 1985, 40 years after the end of the war, we had our first school reunion. When the school finished, and most of those children returned back, they came back and found no one, and nothing, and not wanted, and eventually dispersed all over the world. And now my friends in my autograph book were living in 11 different countries. Some of us used to meet, a few of us lived in London, and then we had the idea, because in 1985 England was celebrating 40 years after the war, that we would try to have a reunion. And we did. About 80 of us all came back to Wales, now grown up adults, but still the mystery of how did we come to England? How did we get there? Who put us on that train? Of course, the person was someone called Nicholas Winton. And this is the biography of Nicholas Winton, written by his daughter. My parents were visiting us in February 1988, having recently learned with joy they would become grandparents. And during that visit, my father was phoned by someone from the BBC. They tracked him down somehow. What happened next turned my father's life from an ordinary personal story into an extraordinary public one. Nothing was the same again for my father after the 27th of February 1988. He searched for home for an old scrapbook documenting the transportation of over 600 children from Czechoslovakia to Britain in 1939 had led him to the BBC studios of That's Life, a popular Sunday night show. And the programme was going to highlight the story that night, and the producers had asked Nicky, which is what we came to call him eventually, to come along to check the accuracy of the script and watch the item from amongst the studio audience. My parents had been given so little preparation of what was to come that Greta, my mother, thinking it might be rather dull, decided to stay at home. She could always watch it on TV and see it as clearly as he did from the audience. They had no idea what was in store. Because a few days previously, I was at home, married, with children. The phone rang, and this woman says, "This is Esther Ranson." Now, if somebody phoned you up and said, "This is David Beckham," would you believe them? I certainly didn't. I said, "Oh yes," I said, "I'm the Queen of England." I thought it was somebody playing a joke. However, she said, "I am Esther Ranson, and we have got in our hands a scrapbook from a man called Nicholas Winton. And in that book, there is a history of how he brought all the children to England, and your name happens to be on one of the lists. And that is a page from one of the lists. And my name and my sister's name are the last two names on that page. She said, "We'd like you to come to the studio because we want to surprise Mr. Winton. We're going to invite him." And I was so taken back. I'd almost forgotten about my past. At the time, not much was talked about the Holocaust and what had happened. I said to her, "Well, I've got friends in London who you could ask." She said, "Yes." So she said, "We've picked out a few names, but we've decided to ask someone, a few people, and could you come?" And so I came to London, and she said, "Now, when you come into the studio, you're not to tell him who you are. We're going to surprise him." And I met my other friends, and I believe some of you have seen this little bit already, because you can find it on YouTube. And Nicholas Winton came down, and with him was a friend, and Esther Ranson said, "Will you please sit behind Mr. Winton?" And he sat him in front, and I was on one side, Vera on the other. And here is now by an elderly person, and she opens this scrapbook and starts telling the story, and she said, "And Mr. Winton, these are the photographs in your book, and on your left is Vera, and I was sitting on his right." And the poor man didn't know what had hit him. He had absolutely no idea that this was going to happen. And of course, it was very emotional. You find yourself sitting next to a man who saved your life. What was interesting was the person sitting behind him. What we didn't know, that Winton at the time was one of the founders of something called the Abbeyfield Homes. And Abbeyfield Homes are homes for old people. One of us, now grown up, living in Sheffield, had become a chairman of the Abbeyfield Homes in Sheffield. And there was an annual general meeting in London. And this man called Rudy Vesely was at the meeting and found himself sitting next to an older gentleman. And when they started chatting, Rudy, who still spoke with a foreign accent, the man said, "Where do you come from?" And he said, "Oh," he said, "many years ago in 1939, I came to England on a train." And the man said, "Oh yes, I organised those trains." And he found himself sitting next to Nicholas Winton. And he turned round and he said, "But you're the man who saved my life." And so he came with Nicholas to the studio. And of course, at the end of the program, we all met him. Vera, who'd been desperately trying to find out for years how she'd got to England, discovered she only lived 15 minutes away from him all these years. And she then became a sort of secretary of his, because from the day one when he was discovered, Esther Ranson said, "Those of you watching this show, please get in touch," because she asked him back the following week and said, "Those of you who came on the train, stand up," and nearly 100 people stood up. But from that day, he was visited, phoned, telegrammed by people from all over the world. People who suddenly realized that they have found the one person who connected them to the parents that they lost, that they didn't know, and now of course themselves married, grown up with children. And at one point, when we all got together with Nicholas, as we did regularly, he said, "I now have a family of 5,000, because that is what was happening. People had got married and met. But why did he do it? What happened to get us to England? The only way he could do it was to advertise, because he was told, unless you find a family, and each family will give up £50 to repatriate the children, they can't come to England. And so he advertised. And this is a page out of a magazine called The Picture Post. It says back in 1939. And it is difficult to read, but what it's telling you, that Picture Post received a letter and some photographs of 2 children asking families to adopt them. And they got replies from Hereford, from Wales, from Hull, from Dublin, from Motherwell. Eventually they got thousands of letters from parents willing to adopt the children that he managed to get to England. We visited him regularly. I live in Preston and he lived in Maidenhead, and I used to come down and visit him and pick up his favourite lunch, which was cauliflower cheese and rice pudding. He became very well known. He went to America, he was invited to Israel, to the Czech Republic, and indeed the Czech Republic probably knows more about him than anyone else. Everybody knows the name of Nicholas Winton. If it's a taxi driver, waitress, businessman, they all know who Nicholas Winton was. I used to visit him, as I say, regularly, and he grew to be quite an old man. He died when he was 106. And within 1 month of him dying, the Czech mail printed a stamp of him. When he was 104, Nicholas loved flying. I'll go back to that. After he had finished rescuing the children he could do no more in 1939, he joined the Air Force. He became a flight instructor, and so he always loved flying. And now we're fast forwarding to when he was 104 years old. And a message came from Prague, from some friends, that they were flying over to an air show. Would he like a flight in a 4-seater Cessna? Now, do any of you know what a 4-seater Cessna looks like? It's a little aeroplane that would fit into the corner. We used to say it's got 4 chairs with an engine. And he said, yes, he would love a flight in a 4-seater Cessna. And so this little aeroplane landed near Maidenhead. And I went down, and Barbara and I collected Nicky and drove him down. And there was this plane. And his daughter, the one who wrote the book, said, I'm not getting in that. And I climbed in the back. The pilot got in, they took off, and every plane has 2 controls. And I was sitting behind him, just imagine, 4 chairs, and I saw the pilot point to the controls in front of Nicholas Winton. And he nodded his head, got hold of the controls, and for half an hour I was being flown by a 104-year-old pilot, because he had never forgotten how to fly a plane, because when he got out he said, it's just like riding a bicycle, you'll never forget. Well, he died when he was 106 years old, but prior to that he had been visited by one of us living in Israel. And they were chatting, and this friend from Israel, whose name I also have in my autograph book because we went to school together, said, you know, Nikki, you're famous, people know about us, but the heroes of our story are our parents. Our parents who had the courage to put us on the train, knowing probably they'll never see us again. And we need to put up a memorial for our parents. And Nikki's answer was, yes, and not before time. There are many memorials to the victims of the Holocaust, memorials to the soldiers who died, but no memorials to the parents. And so the message came from Israel, one to me, one to Prague. There are now not many of us left, saying we need to do something about putting up a memorial for the parents. And so we set up a little committee in Prague. And And how do you start putting up a memorial? Where do you put it? How do you design it? And so we had a competition first at the School of Art and Design, but we didn't like any of the results. Until my friend in Prague, who'd also come on the train, said, you know, I remember the railway station. I remember our parents waving us goodbye, and we on the train reaching out for them. And that was the memorial. We found a man in Slovakia who was an expert in copying railway trains. We found a carriage in a train museum where he copied the door. And another glass designer who made the window of that door. And in the window are 4 little hands on one side. And those 4 little hands, 2 of them are my great-granddaughter, and 2 of them are great-grandchildren of my friend in Prague. And the parents' hands on the other side. And the memorial now stands in Prague railway station. There was another phrase on the power of words, and that was, how can life go on? And it is a story of someone who was also should have gone on the train, but begged her parents not to send her. Her name was Susannah. And when Susannah was 6 years old, she was very ill. And her parents said to her, if you get better, you can have whatever you want. And she said, I'd like to have a piano lesson. By now, in 1939, she's 11 years old, and quite obviously a very gifted pianist, begging her parents not to send her on the train, because she was also on the list to go. Her parents relented and didn't. They were Jewish. And in 1942, like my grandparents, like all the other Jewish population, Susannah and her father and mother were told to pack a case and were taken to Terezin, known as Theresienstadt, which was a ghetto for the Jews who were taken there before they were eventually sent to other concentration camps. She was there for a year, where her parents died. And then the day came when it was their turn to be transported to Auschwitz. When I was in Terezin, I always had a sort of talisman in my mind, a Bach saraband in E minor. And I loved this saraband very much. And I wrote it on a piece of paper, and I had it always with me. When my mother and I were separated at the Auschwitz railway station, and I was put on a truck, and my mother was sent to the left, there came a gust of wind, and I was holding this piece of paper, and it flew out of my hand. And my mother, knowing what it meant to her, dashed out, picked up the paper, it was so chaotic, dashed to the lorry on which Susannah was taken, handed her the paper, and she was pulled into the lorry with other friends, thus saving her life. Had she stopped on the queue on the left, they were designated to go to the gas chambers. Immediately, we were told about the gas chambers, and I didn't believe it straight away. I was a child, and looking at those gas chambers and those fires and the terrible stench, I used to run to my mother and say, I want to live. Well, they survived Auschwitz, the most terrible conditions. And in 1944, when the Allies, when the Allies started coming into Europe, Susannah and her mother and a few of the more fit prisoners were sent to Hamburg to start collecting rubble because of the bombing that was going on. And of course, by now, her hands were getting very damaged. And in 1945, they were eventually sent to Belsen, one of the most dreadful concentration camps, which in fact was the first camp that the British Army entered when they started moving into Germany, and found Susannah and her mother. She by now is very ill, but was taken to hospital, and eventually with her mother allowed to go home. Not to the house where they used to live. They were Jewish. Jews were not welcome. A lot of anti-Semitism going on, but they were allocated 2 rooms. And Susannah's music teacher that she'd had before the war saw her, cried and said, well, perhaps you could be an interpreter, because she did speak a couple of other languages. However, she was so determined that she wanted to play again, she started practicing and practicing, and after 2 years she was allowed to join a music school. She wanted to play the harpsichord. Eventually she started playing. She married a composer, and in 1956, under the communist regime, which is another area of history you will be learning about, she was allowed to enter a competition, and she won it. And from then on, she became one of the most best-known harpsichord players, not only in the Czech Republic, in Europe. And I mentioned the word Bach because when Susannah was 90, there's a magazine. I believe you've just got a new music teacher at school. There's a magazine called The Music Magazine. When she was 90, there was to be a great big birthday party for her in Prague. That is her picture. And why I'm telling you this story, because Susannah was my cousin, and she was one of the few people of my family that survived the concentration camps. And I used to see her regularly, meet her in Prague, and I was at her 90th birthday party. I was able to take her a cake, and sadly she died a year later. But that is one of the phrases of how can life go on. Now, I'm involved in an organization called Safe Passage. They are helping to get refugee children to the country now. Children who are orphans, like many of us became. And here we are in London, and the man standing in the center is called Lord Dubs. Alf Dubs, Alf, who I went to school with, who was also one of the Winton children, who is now fighting very hard to help to bring the refugee children of today. And I was there with him. We were just outside Westminster asking, please allow more refugee children to come to this country. I was a very lucky girl. I was saved by Nicholas Winton. Thank you.